Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and today we're going to be discussing some of the more unusual discoveries when it comes to the idea of learning. Because for a very long time, the scientific consensus was that learning, or basically the ability to change your behavior based on experience, was generally a process that involved some kind of a complex organism, and an organism that essentially contained a relatively large brain, or at least some kind of a complex nervous system, possessing at least some types of synapses. But as we've discussed in so many previous videos, sometimes nature decides to surprise us in a lot of different ways. And many times nature is a lot stranger than we initially assumed. And so in this video we're going to discuss some of the recent studies that explore this idea of learning from slightly different perspectives and reveal to us that learning might be actually a much more universal phenomenon that involves a lot of different types of living matter that doesn't always possess brains. And sometimes even involves just single cells. But even more bizarrely, we're going to talk about this other study that even involved molecules, or specifically molecular networks, that are normally used to regulate genes. And so let's basically dive into these somewhat unexpected discoveries and discuss what all of this means for our understanding of what it actually means to know something. But first, as always, let's establish a bit of a context. And that's because most scientists and most psychologists divide learning into two main types. First, we have what's known as the non-associative learning. This usually includes things like, for example, habituation, where an organism slowly stops responding to something, for example, some kind of a stimulus, and eventually starts ignoring it, because the stimulus does not seem to do anything. So, for example, in humans, ignoring things like ticking clocks is a type of habituation. But the second type of learning is a little bit more important and also way more complex. This is known as the associative learning, and most famously it's sometimes also referred to as the Pavlovian conditioning, also known as classical conditioning or respondent conditioning. In some sense named after the famous Ivan Pavlov, who discovered all of this when experimenting with dogs. And here this is essentially when some kind of an organism learns that some sort of a signal, like for example a sound of a bell, predicts some kind of an event, such as for example sudden appearance of food. And that's of course what Pavlov did with his dogs. And while for over a century we actually thought that this type of learning, this associative learning, required some kind of a brain, or at least an ability to create synapses inside some kind of a neural network. But a recent study that, as always, you can find in the description, and a study you can see right here by scientists from Harvard, confirms that that's not actually the case. In this recent research, using a giant single-cell organism referred to as Stantor caeruleus, completely redefines our definition of associative learning. And well, here let's, talk about the organism first. In this case, Stantor is a kind of a trumpet-shaped protozoan, or a single-cell organism, that usually lives in ponds and can actually get pretty big. It can be up to about 2 millimeters in size, meaning that you can technically see it with your eyes. And that's of course really massive for a single cell. But because this is a single cell, it has no neurons, no brain, and is unable to produce synapses. Yet here, in a fascinating series of experiments, researchers at Harvard applied a bunch of mechanical taps to various petri dishes containing these cells. And normally, if you tap strongly, the Stantor cell contracts and becomes a tiny sphere in order to protect itself. But if the tap is weak enough, it usually does not bother because it does not perceive any threat. But here scientists started doing something somewhat interesting. They essentially started pairing certain taps. Or basically they would have a weak tap with the strong tap precisely 1 second later. And turns out that after just a few repetitions, Stantor cells started contracting even when there was no strong tap, but only a weak tap that it previously ignored. Or essentially here the cells started to associate different signals. It somehow learned that signals seem to be correlated and definitively displayed a type of a classical conditioning that we have never seen in single cells. And so here it was able to predict the appearance of the strong signal using some kind of a machinery that we obviously do not understand. And this of course implies that this type of a learning machinery seems to have existed for billions of years, and much earlier than the existence of the first brain that we think potentially started to evolve 100 million years ago. Although in this case, the learning was only temporary, and the cells eventually stopped responding to the weak taps as time went on. Either way though, this definitely makes this the first ever example of a single-cell organism being able to learn just like a complex animal. And right now the only explanation we have is that maybe this somehow happens through some kind of a molecular change inside, involving touch-sensitive receptors and some kind of a calcium signaling inside the cell. But at the moment, none of this is actually known. And so here, this new concept is now known as the aneural learning, or basically learning without a brain. Although technically something somewhat similar has been observed in the now famous slime molds. The organisms that basically also contain no brain or nervous system, but do exhibit complex behaviors. Although technically this is not a single cell as much as a plasmodium, or basically a massive cell containing lots of different nuclei and lots of different organelles from all of the cells joined together. But you can learn more about slime molds in one of the previous videos in the description. But when it comes to learning, turns out that it goes much deeper than just single cells. Because turns out that sometimes even smaller things, in this case molecular networks, can also exhibit learning. And in this case, we do have at least a few studies that seem to tackle this idea as well. And specifically based on a type of a molecular network referred to as gene regulatory network. This is something that every cell in our body seems to contain, and you can kind of think of them as the software of the cell. Basically, these are sets of genes and various proteins that turn each other on and off in order to regulate everything inside the cell itself. Everything from metabolism to, for example, how the cell is going to heal itself after injury. And historically, biologists treated these types of networks as a type of a biological machine, or basically a rigid machine that sort of relied on if-then commands similar to a computer. And if something was broken, we thought that we had to rewire these networks in order to make them operate correctly. This would usually involve some kind of a gene editing therapy in order to conduct some kind of a physical editing. But based on some of the recent simulations from the study you can find in a description, and specifically simulations of these biological GRNs, researchers have shown that they seem to also be able to learn, or specifically they seem to be trainable. And so here, by applying a specific chemical signal to certain nodes in a network, scientists were able to teach these molecular pathways to associate neutral drugs with some kind of a functional drug. Or essentially they conditioned these networks to respond to a harmless stimulus as if it was some kind of a powerful medication. So yeah, they basically simulated a placebo effect. And beyond just being a cool discovery, this does have somewhat massive implications for the medical field. So for example, we know that a lot of patients eventually develop what's known as tolerance for various types of drugs such as opioids. Or basically they require higher and higher doses in order to have the same effect. And this often has a very dangerous side effect of potential addiction or a possible overdose. And what it looks like it might be caused by an unusual type of learning we've never considered before. And so essentially here, if we can understand how these molecular pathways remember drug exposure, we might be able to use some kind of a memory wiping technique in order to reset the pathways and in order to make drugs efficient at much lower doses. Now exactly how to do this is of course unknown for now, but that's basically one of the implications from the study. And so here, just like a typical brain, these networks seem to be able to remember stimuli even after the actual trigger is gone. And based on the study right now, researchers already propose at least some solutions. For example, there might be a way to produce certain bioelectric signals where specific inputs could actually force the gene network to change completely that would make the person much healthier. Although intriguingly, one of the other discoveries in this case was also the fact that it was actually kind of difficult to make these networks forget. This was actually one of the more unexpected discoveries, because these networks seem to remember things for a pretty long time, and once again through means we don't really understand yet. So it's as if learning creates some kind of a permanent upgrade to the entire system, we're talking about a molecular system, that seems to persist even after the specific memory is already gone. And this of course suggests that the evolution might favor organisms that learn because the very act of learning makes their internal systems much more cohesive and much better at solving various problems that might affect the organism's health. With a lot of these studies essentially showing us that evolution seems to have found a way to scale this idea of intelligence and learning from simple molecules and simple organisms all the way to complex organisms like us. And so learning seems to be some kind of a very important feature that exists at different levels. But for biology in general, this is also a very important paradigm shift, because it essentially confirms that learning is not just some kind of a brain thing. It does appear to be a fundamental property of a lot of complex networks, and networks made out of different things involving neurons, signaling proteins, or even basic chemicals. Which means that this is a very interesting continuum that seems to exist in a lot of different types of life. But as we keep learning about all of this, and essentially as we move forward, we're starting to see that we're not just some kind of a collection of different parts governed by blind physics and biology, but instead even our individual cells and even individual molecules inside of us seem to form their own basal cognition that helps them navigate the world. And that of course has a lot of implications on the idea of intelligence as well. Something we're going to be discussing very soon in one of the videos that's going to be coming out in the next few weeks. And so until then, subscribe, come back tomorrow to learn something else, support the channel on Patreon where you can find additional videos without any ads and can DM me directly, or by joining the channel membership that grants you early access and a few additional videos. You can also support this channel by buying the Wonderful Person t-shirt in the description below. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.